In 1630, a bizarre scene unfolded at a public execution ground. In Beijing, a man was being executed by lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. But the crowd watching wasn't horrified. They were lining up to buy pieces of his flesh. They believed this man had betrayed the Ming Dynasty, conspired with the enemy, and nearly caused the fall of Beijing. His name was Yuan Chonghuan. 15 years later, Beijing fell. The Ming Dynasty collapsed, and only then did the people begin to realize the man they had torn apart with their own hands was the last person who could have held the enemy back. Yuan Chonghuan was a rare figure in the final years of the Ming Dynasty. By that time, the rising Zhoushan state, known as Later Jin, had been pushing deeper into Ming territory, and the northeastern defense line was crumbling. The Ming court could barely find a general capable of winning a battle. Yuan Chonghuan was one of the very few exceptions. At the Battle of Ningyuan, he repelled Nurhaci's assault. The first time the Zhoushan forces had suffered a serious defeat since their rise to power. At the Battle of Ningjin, he held the line again. When Huang Taiji succeeded Nurhaci, he faced a straightforward reality. As long as Yuan Chonghuan held the northeast, a frontal breakthrough was nearly impossible. But Huang Taiji was an extraordinarily sharp strategist. He understood that sometimes destroying an enemy doesn't require defeating him on the battlefield. A far more effective method is to make his own people turn against him. And inside the Ming court, the cracks were already there. Emperor Chongzhen had taken the throne at just 17, young, impatient, and deeply suspicious. Yuan Chonghuan commanded a large army on the frontier and sometimes made decisions before reporting to the court. What unsettled Chongzhen the most was one particular incident. Yuan Chonghuan had executed another Ming general, Ma Wenlong, without imperial authorization. Whatever the reasons may have been, this act planted a seed in the young emperor's mind. Could this man one day disregard even the emperor himself? Chongzhen never spoke this suspicion aloud, but it was already there. The court was no safer ground. Some officials resented the enormous military spending with no decisive victory to show for it. Others were jealous of Yuan's authority, and some had never forgiven him for killing Ma Wenlong. None of these people necessarily wanted Yuan Chonghuan dead, but none of them would speak up for him when it mattered. What Huang Taiji saw clearly were these exact cracks. He didn't need to create suspicion from nothing. He only needed to make the suspicion that already existed impossible to ignore. In the winter of 1629, Huang Taiji made a bold move. Instead of attacking Yuan Chonghuan's fortified northeastern defense line head-on, he led his army on a detour through Mongolian territory, broke through a section of the Great Wall, and marched straight toward Beijing. This maneuver was itself the most critical step in the plan, because the moment enemy forces appeared outside Beijing, every person in the city would instinctively ask the same questions. Where was Yuan Chonghuan's defense line? How did the enemy get through? Did someone let them in on purpose? Huang Taiji didn't even need to plant these doubts himself. He just needed to create the conditions for doubt to grow on its own. When Yuan Chonghuan learned that Huang Taiji had bypassed his line and was heading for Beijing, he immediately led his troops on a desperate march south. engaging the Jurchen forces outside the Guangkou Gate. But here was the problem. He arrived too fast. So fast that people inside Beijing began whispering, "How did he get here so quickly? Did he know the enemy was coming all along? Was this arranged between them?" If he had arrived late, he would have been blamed for failing to respond. But arriving too quickly made him look even more suspicious. Once a person is already under suspicion, almost anything they do can be interpreted as evidence of guilt. According to later historical records, Huang Taiji very likely deployed a carefully designed counterintelligence operation. At this point, officers were arranged to hold a secret conversation outside a tent, discussing how Yuan Chonghuan had already struck a deal with later Jin. This conversation was conveniently overheard, with two Ming Dynasty eunuchs being held nearby. The guards then carelessly allowed the eunuchs to escape back to Beijing, where they delivered this top-secret intelligence straight to the emperor. Whether every detail of this scheme happened exactly as the histories describe may no longer be fully verifiable, but one thing is almost certain. Huang Taiji succeeded in detonating the suspicion that had been beating inside Chongqing all along. What made this intelligence truly lethal was not how clever it was. It was that it perfectly explained the fear everyone was already feeling. A 19-year-old emperor, enemy forces closing in on the capital, no way of knowing whether the situation would collapse entirely by tomorrow. In moments like this, what people need most is not evidence, it's an explanation. Why did the enemy suddenly appear outside Beijing? Why didn't the defense line stop them? Whose fault is this? And Yuan Chonghuan is a traitor, explained everything. When people are gripped by fear, they will instinctively believe whichever story best explains what is happening to them, even if that story isn't true. Chongzhen summoned Yuan Chonghuan to the palace and arrested him on the spot. What happened next was perhaps even more disturbing. Yuan Chonghuan sat in prison for nearly a year while the court deliberated. But what kept the trial moving forward was no longer evidence. It was the system itself, beginning to run on autopilot. Once the emperor had signaled his suspicion, the political winds were set. Officials who had resented Yuan Chonghuan began stepping forward to expose him, accusing him of treason, of eliminating Mao Wenlong on behalf of the enemy, of deliberately allowing the Jurchen forces through. Those who accused him were rewarded as loyal servants. Those who defended him risked being suspected of complicity. And so, a case that many privately believed was likely unjust met almost no resistance on its way to a verdict. In the third year of Chongqing's reign, Yuan Chonghuan was executed by lingchi. On the day of the execution, the people of Beijing jeered and cursed, fighting to buy his flesh. Their rage was real, because by that point, the emperor had convicted him. The court had tried him, officials had testified against him, and a public execution had been carried out. Every voice of authority was saying the same thing. And whenever channel of information carries only one message, doubt itself starts to feel like a mistake. After Yuan Chonghuan's death, the Ming Dynasty's northeastern defense line never truly recovered. 15 years later, Beijing fell. Chongzhen hanged himself on Coal Hill. The Ming Dynasty was over. A dynasty had killed the last man capable of protecting it. And what set the whole thing in motion may have been nothing more than a story, quietly slipped into a crack that was already there. Years later, looking back on all of this, perhaps the most unsettling part is not that someone was foolish or evil or deceived. It's that nearly everyone involved was making what felt like a perfectly reasonable choice. Huang Taiji exploited the cracks. Chongzhen, consumed by fear, chose the safest judgment available. Court officials followed the political winds, and the people of Beijing, sealed inside a closed information environment, accepted the conclusion that every authority had agreed upon. No one believed they were doing anything wrong. Every step looked logical. And yet, all of those logical steps taken together led to the most illogical outcome imaginable. Perhaps what makes this story truly chilling is the quiet realization that if you had been alive back then, you almost certainly would have been standing in that crowd too.